In July of last year, the Winooski River rose almost 14 feet above its normal summer level in under 18 hours. It tore through backyards in Montpelier, flooded the state capitol basement, and left crews across central Vermont with weeks of cleanup ahead of them before anyone could even think about rebuilding. Most of that cleanup was exactly what you would expect: mud, ruined drywall, cars pulled out of places cars should never be. But along one stretch of riverbank outside a small town northeast of the capital, a crew clearing debris from a scoured out section of shoreline found something that made them stop working entirely and call a state archaeologist instead of a dump truck. My name is Marlo Reed, and if you have watched this channel before, you know how this usually goes. Something ordinary breaks open, and underneath it is a piece of the past that nobody had bothered to look for. I want to walk you through this one carefully, because unlike some of the stories I cover, this one is still actively being investigated, and the people doing that work deserve to have it described accurately rather than sensationally. The Vermont everyone already knows. Before we get to the riverbank, it is worth spending a minute on what Vermont's rivers are generally assumed to be, because that assumption matters for understanding why this find caught everyone off guard. Vermont sells itself, accurately for the most part, as a landscape of small hill farms, covered bridges, sugar maples, and rivers that look like they belong on a calendar. The Winooski, the Lamoille, the White, the Otter Creek, all of them cutting through valleys that have been farmed by European settlers since the late 1700s, and before that, inhabited by Abenaki communities for thousands of years. That second part, the thousands of years before European settlement, has always been acknowledged in the history books. Nobody in Vermont archaeology has ever pretended the Abenaki were not here. But the working assumption for decades was that Abenaki land use in this region was light on the landscape. Seasonal camps, fishing stations, hunting grounds moved through and used, but not substantially built or engineered in a way that would leave large physical traces. The rivers themselves were treated in most planning documents and most restoration models as essentially natural systems that people passed through rather than shaped. That assumption did real work. It shaped how riverbanks got zoned, how flood mitigation projects got designed, how construction permits got issued along hundreds of miles of Vermont waterway, and it is the exact assumption that a summer of catastrophic flooding ended up cracking open along with the riverbank itself, how a flood exposes what a river usually hides. To understand why a flood, of all things, could reveal something archaeologists had never documented, you need to understand what floodwater actually does to a riverbank, because it is not simply erosion in the vague sense most people picture. Vermont's rivers move fast for their size: steep valleys, rocky beds, and a watershed that can dump several inches of rain in a single afternoon during the wrong kind of summer storm. Under normal conditions, a river like the Winooski carries a moderate sediment load, and its banks stay relatively stable, protected by root systems, grass, and the simple fact that most years the water never gets high enough to test them seriously. A flood like the one Vermont saw last July is a different animal entirely. Water moving at flood stage does not just rise, it scours. It rips vegetation and topsoil off the banks in long strips, sometimes down to bare subsoil or bedrock, and it does this unevenly, tearing away decades or centuries of accumulated sediment in some stretches, while leaving others almost untouched. Normally, that just means a damaged bank that needs to be stabilized and replanted before the next high water season. This time, in one particular bend of the river, where the current had scoured especially deep, stripping away what turned out to be roughly 4 feet of accumulated silt and gravel, it exposed something that had been sitting under that sediment for a very long time. What the crew actually found. The cleanup crew working that stretch was contracted by the town to clear down trees and stabilize the worst of the erosion before it undermined a nearby road. One of the workers, moving debris near the water line, noticed that what he had assumed was a scattered pile of naturally rounded river stones was actually arranged in a pattern, not randomly scattered the way stones tumble and settle in moving water, but laid out in 2 converging lines that met at a narrow point close to the current channel, like the sides of a funnel built out of rock. He is on record saying that his first thought was old farm debris, maybe a collapsed stone wall that had slumped down the bank at some point over the last 2 centuries. Vermont is covered in old stone walls. Nobody would have blinked twice at that explanation. But something about the shape bothered him enough that he took photographs before doing anything else and sent them to the town's public works office instead of just clearing the stones out of the way. That decision, made by someone with no archaeological training at all, is the entire reason this story exists. If he had cleared the stones the way he was contracted to do, this would simply be a flood cleanup story with no second chapter. The photographs made their way within a few days to the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation, and a field archaeologist was sent out to look at the site in person before any further work happened along that stretch of bank. What she found, once she got a proper look at the exposed pattern without debris piled on top of it, was not one funnel-shaped arrangement of stones. It was several, spaced along roughly 200 feet of newly exposed riverbed and lower bank, all oriented the same direction relative to the current. Ruling out the boring explanations first, before anyone gets excited and before I get ahead of myself here, it is worth walking through the mundane explanations, because that is how this kind of investigation is actually supposed to work. You eliminate the ordinary possibilities before you start entertaining the interesting ones. The first candidate was agricultural debris, exactly what the original worker had guessed. Vermont farmers built stone walls for 2 centuries, clearing fields and piling the rocks along property lines, and plenty of those walls have slumped, collapsed, or been buried by later flooding and sediment. This is common enough that it is almost the default explanation for any organized-looking stone feature found along a Vermont waterway, except stone walls do not typically form narrow converging funnels pointed into the current. They run in straight or gently curving lines along field boundaries, and they are built from stones stacked in courses, not river cobbles, left roughly in place on the original stream bed. The second candidate was old mill infrastructure. Vermont's rivers powered an enormous number of small mills throughout the 1800s, and mill dams, sluices, and foundation stones show up regularly during riverbank work. This was a genuinely reasonable guess, and it took actual investigation to rule out. Mill foundations, though, tend to show tool marks, mortar, iron fittings, and a level of squared construction that these stones simply did not have. Every stone in the exposed features was unmodified river cobble, placed rather than cut, with no trace of the metal fasteners or work joints you would expect from 19th century industrial construction. The team also checked historical maps and insurance survey records from the mill era, standard documents for this kind of verification, and found no record of any structure at this particular bend. Mills tended to cluster near town centers, where there was a market for the flour or lumber they produced. This stretch of river sat well outside any historical settlement boundary. The third candidate, and the one that took the longest to rule out properly, was that this was simply a natural stone bar, the kind of cobble accumulation that rivers create on their own where the current slows or splits around an obstruction. Rivers absolutely do build features like this without any human involvement, and any responsible archaeologist has to seriously consider it before claiming otherwise. What argued against it ultimately was the consistency. A natural cobble bar varies with the specific hydraulics of its location. These funnel shapes, spaced along 200 feet of bank, all shared the same orientation, the same rough dimensions, and the same converging geometry, regardless of small variations in the local current at each individual spot. That kind of repeated consistency across multiple locations is not what unmanaged river hydraulics typically produce on their own. A hydrologist brought in to consult on the site ran a basic flow model comparing what natural cobble deposition would look like at each of the map funnel locations given the modern channel shape. In 3 of the 5 documented features, the model predicted a bar shape meaningfully different from what was actually there, wider, less symmetrical, oriented slightly differently relative to the main current. That mismatch between predicted natural deposition and observed structure was, for several people on the team, the point where the natural explanation stopped being the most likely one on the table, what the stones actually were. Once the mundane explanations had been seriously tested and set aside, the state archaeology team brought in a specialist with experience in a specific and outside of certain academic circles, not especially well-known category of structure, a stonefish weir. Fish weirs are exactly what they sound like, stone or wood structures built across a river or stream, shaped to funnel migrating fish. Historically, alewives, shade, and Atlantic salmon running up Vermont's rivers to spawn into a narrow point where they could be caught by net, trap, or spear. They have been documented in the archaeological record across the northeastern United States and eastern Canada, built by indigenous communities for thousands of years, and in a handful of well-preserved cases, radiocarbon dated to periods well before European contact. One of the better-known comparable sites sits in Maine, where a weir complex uncovered decades ago during construction work returned dates suggesting continuous use across several thousand years, a finding that reshaped how researchers in that region think about pre-contact fishing economies. The Vermont find is not identical to that site, but the underlying structural logic, stones arranged to concentrate fish movement at a narrow catchable point, is the same principle applied to a different river. The Abenaki, whose homeland covers most of what is now Vermont and New Hampshire, had well-documented seasonal fishing practices tied to spring spawning runs, gathering at productive river stretches for weeks at a time to harvest and process fish for the rest of the year. That part of the historical and oral record has never been disputed. What had never been documented in this particular stretch of the Winooski watershed, though, was physical evidence of the actual engineered structures used to do it, because those structures, built low and wide across a riverbed, are exactly the kind of feature that gets buried under sediment within a few decades, if nobody is actively maintaining them, and exactly the kind of feature that stays buried until something like catastrophic flood scouring strips the sediment back off. The specialist noted something else worth mentioning here, which is that the funnel orientation at this site pointed consistently toward what would have been, based on historical fish population data and the shape of the river at this bend, the most efficient interception point for a spring spawning run moving upstream. That is not something a farmer building a stone wall or a mill operator laying foundation stones would have any reason to account for. It is precisely the kind of detail that only makes sense if the people who built it understood in intimate and practical terms exactly how the fish in this river actually moved. The team sent samples of organic material trapped in the gaps between the placed stones, along with sediment cores taken immediately above and below the stone layer, out for radiocarbon dating. The results, when they came back several weeks later, moved this from an interesting local curiosity to something that regional archaeologists were actively emailing each other about. What the dating actually showed: the organic material recovered from directly within the weir structure returned dates clustering between roughly 900 and 1400 years before present, placing active use of at least this section of the site well within the period before European contact, consistent with sustained Abenaki fishing practice at this specific location for a span of centuries. That alone would have been a solid, publishable, moderately interesting local archaeology story. What made it more than that was a second set of dates, pulled from a deeper layer beneath one of the stone funnels, from a small pocket of charcoal and organic sediment that appeared to represent an even earlier phase of construction or use. Those samples returned dates considerably older, pushing back toward roughly 3,000 years before present, a site used, apparently with some consistency, across a span of time stretching from 3,000 years ago into the relatively recent past is not a single event. It is not one group of people who happened to camp at a good fishing spot one season. It is the kind of finding that indicates sustained, intergenerational knowledge of exactly where on a river to build a structure like this, maintained and rebuilt across a time scale that, again, makes most of what we typically consider ancient history look comparatively recent. I want to slow down on that number for a second, because it is easy to read past it. 3,000 years ago, before the structure at the deepest layer was even the older phase of use at this site, is roughly the era of the earliest Iron Age settlements in parts of Europe. People were building and maintaining fishing infrastructure on this exact bend of this exact river for a period of time that spans almost the entirety of recorded human civilization elsewhere in the world, and nobody driving past that spot on the road above the river for as long as anyone alive can remember had any reason to know it was there. There's a detail in the dating results that the team has been more cautious discussing publicly, and I want to represent it accurately rather than overstate it. The gap between the older charcoal layer and the more recent stone construction is not perfectly continuous in the samples collected so far. There appear to be stretches of time, possibly extending across centuries, where the site shows no clear evidence of active use before construction resumes. Researchers are careful to note that this could simply reflect gaps in the limited sampling done to date rather than genuine periods of abandonment, and further coring planned for next season should help clarify which explanation actually fits. It is exactly the kind of open question that responsible archaeology leaves open rather than resolving prematurely for the sake of a cleaner story. Why nobody had found this before? This is the part of the story that I think is genuinely worth sitting with, separate from the archaeology itself. A stone fish weir spanning a river channel is not a small feature, Under the right conditions, it should be visible. So why had nobody documented this stretch before? In a state with a genuinely active historic preservation program and a documented, well-studied indigenous history? The honest answer is sediment. Vermont's rivers, especially in the stretches that flow through farmland and, more recently, through eroding development along the banks, carry a substantial sediment load in an ordinary year, and that sediment settles preferentially in exactly the kind of slower-moving stretches where a fish weir would have originally been built to take advantage of the current. Over centuries, normal seasonal flooding, nothing close to the scale of last July's event, gradually buried these structures under a slow accumulation of silt and gravel. By the time European settlers arrived and began building their own mills and dams along these same rivers, the older stone features were likely already substantially covered, and 2.5 centuries of continued sediment deposit did the rest. It took a genuinely unusual event, flooding severe enough to scour 4 feet of accumulated material off the bank in a matter of hours, rather than gradually depositing more on top of it to reverse that process even briefly. The archaeologist who first examined the site has been quoted saying that under normal circumstances, a survey team would need to conduct deliberate subsurface excavation informed by exactly the kind of prior knowledge nobody had to ever find something like this. The flood did in 18 hours what a research grant and a 5-year survey plan might never have gotten around to doing at all. What this means for how the river gets managed. Here's where this stops being purely a story about the past and starts having real consequences for the present, because Vermont, like a lot of places that just survived a catastrophic flood, is in the middle of an enormous amount of active discussion about how to rebuild and how to manage its rivers going forward to reduce the damage from the next one. Flood mitigation work along Vermont waterways typically involves exactly the kind of riverbank modification that would have destroyed this site without anyone knowing what was lost. Bank stabilization, channel reshaping, sediment removal, the installation of erosion control structures, all standard tools in a flood management toolkit, and all activities that, applied to a stretch of river like this one, without proper archaeological review, could permanently erase evidence of thousands of years of continuous human history before anyone had the chance to document it. The Division for Historic Preservation has, since this discovery became public within the professional community, begun the process of flagging comparable stretches of river throughout the watershed for archaeological sensitivity review before any future flood mitigation work proceeds. That is a genuinely significant procedural shift, and it did not happen because of a grant proposal or a 5-year research plan. It happened because a flood accidentally did the survey work first and handed researchers a result nobody could ignore. There is also, and I think this deserves to be said plainly, a question of who gets consulted going forward. Abenaki communities in Vermont, who have spent decades working to have their history in this landscape formally recognized, much of it in the face of historical policies that actively suppress that recognition, are now directly involved in decisions about how this site and comparable ones are studied, protected, and talked about publicly. That consultation is standard, appropriate practice for a discovery like this, and from what I have been able to confirm, it is happening the way it should, carefully and without a rush to publish or excavate before the people with the deepest connection to this history have a say in how it proceeds. Vermont state government only formally recognized several Abenaki bands within the last 15 years, a delay that community members have pointed out made this kind of collaborative archaeological consultation effectively impossible for most of the 20th century, regardless of what evidence might have been sitting in the ground the entire time. What is still buried? Only a small portion of the exposed stretch has been formally documented so far. The rest of the site remains largely as the flood left it, partially exposed and partially still covered, sitting under a tarp and a fence line while the state works through the process of proper archaeological recording before winter weather and the next high water season potentially rebury or further damage what is left uncovered. There is also the open question of how far this extends. The archaeologist who led the initial assessment has noted that similar geological and hydrological conditions, slower moving bends with a history of gradual sediment accumulation, exist at dozens of other points along the Winooski and comparable rivers throughout the state. Nobody has surveyed those stretches specifically for buried weir structures because until last July, nobody had a strong reason to think they needed to. That work is now beginning, slowly and carefully, informed by exactly the kind of site this flood happened to expose. I keep coming back to something fairly simple as I put this story together. A river that most people, myself included before I started researching this, would have described as a pretty mostly natural feature of the Vermont landscape, turns out to have been actively shaped, engineered, and maintained by people for a period of time that dwarfs the 2.5 centuries since European settlement began, not shaped in the dramatic, monumental sense of a pyramid or a fortress, shaped the way most real human history actually happens, through generations of people solving the same practical problem in the same effective way, at the same good spot on the river, over and over for thousands of years, until the accumulated evidence of that practice quietly settled under enough silt that it stopped looking like anything but a riverbank. The flood did not create this history. It just stripped away the layer that had been hiding it, the same way a wildfire strips away sawgrass, the same way an underwater drone strips away the assumption that a swimming hole is only as deep as anyone has bothered to look. Vermont is a small state, heavily documented, heavily studied, and it still took a natural disaster to reveal something. This significant sitting in plain sight beneath a stretch of river people have driven past for 200 years. I do not know yet how much more is down there, along this river or the dozens of others that drain this same landscape. Neither does anyone currently working on this, and I would trust them a great deal less if they claimed otherwise. What I do know is that the work is ongoing, that it is being done carefully, and that the next time a river this size floods this badly, somewhere else in this state or somewhere else entirely, it is worth asking what else has been sitting quietly under the water the whole time, waiting for the one event that finally strips the cover away. There is something worth sitting with in how quickly this could have gone unnoticed even after the flood exposed it. A single worker on a single job site made a decision to photograph an oddly shaped pile of rocks rather than simply clear it out of the way and move on to the next section of bank. That decision took him perhaps 2 extra minutes out of a long, exhausting cleanup shift. Multiply that moment across every flood-damaged riverbank in the state, every construction crew working against a deadline to reopen a road or stabilize a slope before winter, and it becomes clear how easily this particular piece of Vermont's history could have gone back into the ground within the same week it was uncovered, unrecorded, and unremembered for another few centuries at least. I am Marlowe Reed. If stories like this one are the reason you keep coming back to this channel, The quiet histories sitting under ordinary places. Subscribe, because rivers flood, fires burn, and ground gets disturbed more often than most of us think about. And every one of those events is a chance for something old to finally get noticed. I will see you in the next one.